Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on something that never seems to leave the headlines, does it? The history of abortion in America. We'll be using excerpts from NPR's Throughline podcast to guide us. And trust me, this history is way more complicated than most people think.
You got that right. The usual story you hear is all like, abortion's always been this super hush-hush controversial thing. But the reality, especially way back in early America, was a whole different ballgame.
No kidding. Okay, so picture this. You open up a newspaper and bam, there's an ad for abortion services. Like, can you imagine? It sounds crazy now, right? But in the early to mid-1800s, abortion, they often called it restoring the menses, was totally normal and pretty much unregulated.
It's wild how differently they thought about life and pregnancy back then. The big idea is that life started at quickening when the mother could feel the fetus moving around. Usually like 4 or 5 months in, ending a pregnancy before that wasn't a big deal, morally or legally.
So it wasn't about life beginning at conception like people argue so much about now.
Nope, not at all. And that really changed how they saw abortions socially and legally. It was something midwives and women practitioners handled, not mainly doctors like today.
And that's where someone like Madame Restell comes in. Her story blows my mind. This woman built a whole thriving abortion practice right on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Not some hidden back alley prime real estate.
She was a total business whiz. No question. Madame Restell advertised out in the open, offered tons of services for women, and worked with both rich and poor clients. Her story flips the whole modern idea of abortion being all secretive and dangerous on its head. It also says a lot about women being entrepreneurs back then, even with all the doors closed to them.
Makes you wonder how different things could be if they'd encouraged that hustle instead of, trying to shut it down. But as we get to the mid-1800s, things start changing big time. And one guy really stands out, Dr. Horatio Storer.
Storer is the guy to understand how things flipped. He's the one who led the charge to outlaw abortion, and his reasons were all mixed up. Part of it was wanting more power for male doctors, but it also tied into the anxieties of the time, especially about race and what women's roles should be.
Okay, break that down for us. What was Storer actually saying, and how did it catch on in that social climate?
So he basically said, forget quickening. Life begins at conception, which meant abortion was murder in his book. And don't forget, this was a time of massive change in America. People were freaking out about immigration, and white Protestant women weren't having as many babies. Storer tapped right into those fears, making abortion sound like a threat to the whole social order.
I think he was using that moral angle to get ahead professionally, too. It feels like he was doing two things at once, knocking out the competition from midwives and women practitioners while making male doctors the big bosses of women's health.
Could be. Storer was a complicated guy, considered a pioneer in obstetrics and gynecology on one hand, but then on the other, he had super conservative ideas about women's bodies and minds. He even pushed for forced sterilization of women he thought were undesirable. It's a dark side of the story we can't ignore.
Totally. And to add another layer of crazy to it all, you have Anthony Comstock and his infamous war on anything obscene coming up around the same time.
Comstock's crusade, which ended up as the Comstock Law in 1873, totally changed how people saw and controlled abortion. That law lumped abortion stuff in with pornography and contraception, made spreading it a federal crime. Talk about moral panic shaping the laws.
It's almost too much to think about. Something as basic as reproductive health care treated like dirty magazines.
Yeah.
And the irony is nuts, right? Comstock, this supposed moral crusader, actually helped doctors like Storer get what they wanted, even though they didn't agree on a lot of other stuff.
It just goes to show you how these movements that seem totally separate can crash into each other and have consequences no one saw coming. So you got these two forces, Storer and Comstock, coming together to change the whole idea and legality of abortion. And sadly, that change really hurt people like Madame Restell.
Her story gets pretty rough, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Comstock went after Madame Restell hard, using traps to get her arrested. She was publicly shamed and dragged through the courts, and tragically, before her trial even happened, she took her own life. It's a heartbreaking end to a story that started with so much guts and entrepreneurial spirit. Really shows the personal cost of all this change around abortion.
This is heavy stuff, and it's only the start. The 1900s take us deeper into the shadows where abortion goes from something people did openly to something hidden and often really dangerous.
Exactly. When every state made it illegal, abortion got pushed underground. And that meant different levels of access and risk depending on where you were. It's a complicated and often tragic chapter that we'll dive into next.
So we're talking turn of the century now. Abortion's outlawed everywhere. It's gone underground. What's that like for women who need it?
Well, picture this. Your experience depends a lot on your social class and race. If you were rich, you might find a doctor discreet, willing to do it. Of course, it'd cost you a fortune. But if you were a woman without that kind of money, it was a whole other story.
They talk about back alley procedures in the Throughline episode. I can't
Mhm.
even imagine how risky that must have been.
It was bad. Untrained people, dirty conditions, huge risk of infection, injury, even death. It was tragic for a lot of women.
There's this really sad story about a woman named Joan Lester. She had an illegal abortion when she was just 19. It really hits you how much these procedures could hurt women physically and emotionally.
Joan's story is heartbreaking, but it wasn't unusual. So many women went through the same thing. Without safe legal options, they were incredibly vulnerable. If something went wrong, they couldn't do much about it.
It's scary to think about how desperate women must felt, first into those dangerous situations. It seems like the laws that were supposed to protect women, to uphold some moral standard, ended up putting their lives in danger.
Yeah, it's a terrible irony. But there's something else happening at this time, too. Medicine's getting better and hospitals are becoming more common.
How'd that affect abortion access?
Hospitals become the main place to have babies, so the fight over abortion moves there, too. Doctors who might have performed abortions in their own practices before now face a lot of scrutiny and legal trouble in hospitals.
So even doctors who understood what women needed were stuck in this new system.
Totally. Hospitals were always worried about lawsuits, so they set up these abortion review committees to decide if each request was valid. They were super strict. Even cases of rape or serious health risks were hard to get approved.
Sounds like a bureaucratic mess, making things even harder for women who needed abortions.
It was. And meanwhile, women still needed these services. The ones who got denied by the system often ended up right back in that dangerous underground market. It was a vicious cycle. In a way, the improvements in medicine that were supposed to help patients actually helped the black market for abortion thrive.
Taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. But you said earlier that this is also when things start shifting towards change, right?
Exactly. By the mid-1900s, there's a growing movement for reform. Doctors are the ones seeing firsthand how bad unsafe abortions are. Infections, complications, deaths that could have been prevented with safe legal access. They start realizing things can't stay the same.
It's interesting how the medical field went from playing a big part in making abortion illegal to pushing for it to be legal again.
Mhm.
What caused that shift?
I think it was a few things. There was a growing understanding of women's health and reproductive rights among doctors themselves. And then you have the women's liberation movement in the 60s fighting for more control over their bodies and choices.
2 different movements coming together with the same goal.
Yeah, of course it wasn't perfectly smooth sailing. The women's movement, even though they were fighting for reproductive rights, were hesitant to team up too closely with the mostly male medical establishment. They were also criticizing how power worked within medicine itself.
There's a tension, a struggle for control.
For sure. But in the end, wanting better access to abortion brought them together, even if it was a little awkward. Feminists brought the voices and experiences of women to the table, and doctors brought their medical knowledge and some legitimacy to the cause.
Together, they changed the conversation, brought the issue of abortion out in the open, and challenged the stigma that had been around it for decades.
Got it. And this led to some reforms in certain states in the late 60s and early 70s, ultimately leading to Roe v. Wade in 73. But while all this momentum for abortion rights was building, there was another movement growing too, the organized pro-life movement.
It's important to remember this wasn't just one side versus the other.
Oh, absolutely. While support for abortion rights was increasing, there was another side forming, mostly rooted in the Catholic Church's opposition to abortion. This movement framed the whole debate in terms of morality, saying life was sacred from the moment of conception. They saw the push for legalization as a direct attack on their beliefs.
So you've got these 2 passionate sides heading for a clash that would end up at the Supreme Court. And that's where things really explode with Roe v. Wade, right?
That's right. Roe v. Wade changed the legal landscape of abortion in America, but it definitely didn't solve the moral and social conflicts underneath. It actually sparked a debate that's still going strong today.
So it's 1973, and the fight over abortion lands right at the Supreme Court's doorstep with Roe v. Wade.
Huge turning point in American history. The court sides with Jane Roe, throws out the Texas law, and basically legalizes abortion across the country.
Well, it's been a massive win for the abortion rights movement. What were the big arguments that swayed the court?
Well, the majority opinion, and it's worth pointing out, this was a 7-2 decision, even with most of the justices appointed by Republicans, leaned hard on the right to privacy. They said choosing to end a pregnancy was part of that fundamental right.
Yeah?
protected by the 14th Amendment.
So a woman's right to choose became about personal freedom and control over her own body.
Exactly. They set up this trimester system. For the first trimester, states couldn't touch abortion laws at all. Second trimester, they could only make rules to protect the mother's health. And only in the third trimester, when the fetus could survive outside the womb, could they ban abortion. And even then, they had to make exceptions to protect the mother's life and health.
Groundbreaking stuff. But you said Roe v. Wade didn't solve everything. What were some of the things it didn't address?
Even though Roe v. Wade made abortion legal everywhere, it didn't give women total control over the decision. The court said the attending physician still had a say, so a woman needed a doctor's. Okay.
So even after it was legal,
Yeah.
abortion was still tied to the medical system.
Yep. And that really bothered some feminists. They said true reproductive freedom meant getting rid of all the obstacles, including needing a doctor's permission.
What about the other side? How did the pro-life movement take the decision?
They were devastated. They saw it as morally wrong, like the law was okaying murder. It made them even more determined to overturn Roe v. Wade, and their movement got stronger.
Sounds like Roe v. Wade just made the fight worse instead of calming things down.
Absolutely. The pro-life movement doubled down, got more organized, and gained political power. They focused on passing strict laws in different states, chipping away at Roe v. Wade little by little. Their goal was to make it easier to overturn the whole thing eventually.
So we've gone from abortion ads in 19th century newspapers to a Supreme Court ruling that would define and divide the nation for decades. What a trip through a complicated and controversial history.
What's really interesting is how this history shows us that the abortion debate isn't just about laws or medical procedures. It's about these huge questions of life, morality, control over your own body, and what role the government should play. Those are questions every generation has to deal with, shaped by the past, but also by what's happening right now.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. Any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up?
I'd say think about how all these twists and turns in history affect how you see abortion. What surprised you? What made you rethink things? Can this knowledge help you talk about these issues with more empathy and understanding, even with people who see things differently? At the end of the day, that's what we need to navigate this complex issue in a way that respects everyone involved.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating look at history. Until then, keep asking questions, stay curious, and we'll see you soon.